All right. So today we are going to be talking about the Aries point, as Donna had mentioned. And what I really want to focus on in today's lecture is more so the mundane manifestation of the Aries point. So how this shows up in terms of planetary cycles, alignments that are activating the Aries point or the Aries point axis, as we'll talk about. And but I'm also going to be connecting many of these more mundane or historical correlations with key figures as well. So we'll look at some personal charts, some timed and some not timed. So these are going to be more kind of notable, well, very notable figures, very paradigm shifting types of individuals. But I do actually want to explore this idea that the symbolism that does seem to kind of emerge in relation to Aries point transits can actually be applicable or can be filtered down to the more personal level. So looking at it in terms of natal chart interpretation and how that applies. So what I'm going to be mostly sharing with you is more so mundane research and how that some themes seem to emerge in relation to that I think are kind of unique and I haven't really heard astrologers really talk about. And we'll see if there's anything to that. And I also welcome any other anything anyone picks up from it. If anyone picks out any specific themes as well that they see from my research, I always find that really interesting. All right, so I wanted to start out with the chart for today's meeting. And I thought this was really interesting. I had a feeling that the Aries point was going to show up here in some way. And I cast this for San Diego, which I actually live in. I'm in North County up in Vista. And the Aries point was very present on all the angles of the chart. And this does seem to be a way that it can show up in charts is basically hitting the angles, which I think is really interesting because it very symbolically connects to that kind of axis and cross. And the Aries point itself will be here on the 7th house. So we are meeting the Aries point today, along with Neptune, and I think unpacking some of its mystique and mystery and perhaps leaving us all with some awe and wonder in relation to it. As an astrologer, I like to always kind of start with just asserting my worldview as an astrologer. And this is just acknowledging the diversity of astrology. There's not only a lot of techniques and paradigms and schools of thought, but there are actually a lot of different worldviews about how astrology works. And so this is just to clarify some language that I use in relation to talking about astrological phenomenon. I talk a lot about reflections and correlations, and that simply connects to my conception of astrology being primarily in a causal and symbolic reflection of worldly affairs. So very much that Hermetic axiom, as above, so below. And I really do believe that astrology reveals synchronicity, which I do think is inherent to the universe or to our experience of it. And that can also be termed a causal phenomenon, which was a term that Carl Jung used, the psychiatrist Carl Jung, in his conception of synchronicity. And so basically, I very much reject materialist metaphysics and embrace more of an idealist conception that actually everything is subjective experience, everything is consciousness. That is a whole other lecture in of itself. But simply to just say that I really don't, I think the bulk of astrological phenomenon is a correlation as a reflection and not a causative force, basically. Okay, so that just clarifies some terms that I'll be using. And then the other part of this is a direct quote from Richard Tarnas, most famously from his work Cosmos and Psyche, and that is astrology is archetypally but not concretely predictive. And I don't assert this as like an absolute truth or that astrology can't concretely predict things. It's just actually not a huge interest of mine. I'm very interested more so as an astrologer and researcher in the archetypal symbolic dimension of life and our experience of it. And also using that as an alternative historiography for understanding the past through this more symbolic lens. So I have a lot of influence from Tarnas and even earlier astrologer Andre Barbeau and his approach to using cycles and connecting those over time. And I'll clarify that a little bit. But yeah, ultimately seeing astrology as the symbolic depiction of reality rather than a literal description. And again, that's a whole other tangent I can go off on, but just some clarification there. I also want to stress the importance of synthesis. So while I'm going to be very myopically focused on the Aries point today, I do want to stress that astrology is ultimately about synthesis. It's about a lot of overlapping symbolic layers. And that is the art ultimately and the challenge of doing astrological interpretation well, is being able to put together all of these pieces that are often sometimes contradicting and paradoxical to make some sort of meaningful, coherent statements or predictions about it. But I just want to stress that astrology, that there's no single alignment that will reflect a specific period of time or will describe the entirety of an individual, their experience. It is always this complex interaction of overlapping symbols. And so I'll be pointing out other cycles actually that have been pretty well established by other astrologers and researchers over the years that have these correlations to what we're talking about. And I'm simply just asking the question, does the Aries point add another additional layer to that of meaning that we can pick out from that? And is that consistent with other events that happen around the Aries point? So there is the challenge of kind of picking out the alignment itself and its own inherent archetypal nature, and then seeing how that is modified by the Aries point, if that makes sense. Okay, so this is our roadmap for today. I'm going to start out by defining the Aries point. Technically, what is the Aries point? It's pretty simple. And then we'll go over its research significance. Why is it significant to research the Aries point? Then we'll talk about a little bit of like a brief literature review of what some astrologers have said about the Aries point and how they use it in their own work or how they found it to show up in mostly in natal chart work. Primarily, that's really seems to be where a lot of astrologers have written about it. And then we'll go into some historical alignments, so transits, eclipses on the AP axis. And I'm actually going to focus more so on, well, I'm going to start with an example from the 17th and 18th century with Jupiter-Saturn alignments. And this is kind of I think a really useful case study to start with because it really stresses that complex interaction of overlapping symbolism and then adding the Aries point into that. So we'll look at two different Saturn-Jupiter alignments that occurred in both those centuries that crossed the AP. And then this will actually be framed very politically at the time. And then we'll leave politics behind and we'll go into three, which might seem strange categories, but actually they are very much related to the power relations that shifted during this period of time in the 17th and 18th centuries. So a lot of these technologies actually resulted from world wars and from struggling power dynamics in the world. And so they had a lot of catalyst from that. And a lot of these were themes that just kept showing up in my research. I just kept finding Aries point alignments happening when these key developments in these areas were happening. And then if I have time, and hopefully I'll have enough time, we'll go over some additional notable figures with AP alignments. I've weaved in some notable figures into the historical stuff, but I had a list of other charts that we'll go maybe through a few of them if I get time. And then we'll draw some conclusions from all of this. Okay, so the Aries point is basically just the vernal equinox, simply. It is 0 degrees of tropical Aries, and it is actually the Aries point axis is actually the structural skeleton of the tropical zodiac. However, it's not entirely contingent on it. You can actually use the Aries point axis in any zodiac system you use. You can project it as a point in those other zodiac systems, but it is a lot easier, I would say, to study it using the tropical zodiac because it's aligned with it, right? So basically the start of the cardinal signs and the end of the mutable signs, and we'll talk about the degree window with it. These transition zones between mutable and cardinal are basically what's known as the Aries point axis. So as you can see in this chart, this diagram here, these are actually 3 different zodiac systems. So the middle wheel is the tropical zodiac that's very commonly used in Western astrology. And the middle wheel is the sidereal zodiac, which is very commonly used more so in Eastern astrology, but there's, again, a lot of diversity today with modern astrologers. And that more roughly aligns with the constellations being that outer wheel. And as you can see, you can just project the Aries point into those areas. The Aries point itself actually aligns with about 6 degrees of sidereal Pisces. So it lands, the axis lands in all the mutable signs, basically, in that system. Okay, so in the tropical system, the AP axis has been conceived as this 4-degree range by most astrologers. So basically the first 2 degrees, of all cardinal signs and the last 2 degrees of mutable signs. And these are the degree ranges basically. So like 28 to 29 Pisces and 0 to 2 Aries and so forth from the mutable to the cardinal signs. So there's been this conception of this 4-degree window with it. Visually, this is basically what it looks like in the tropical zodiac. It is basically those transition zones between the mutable and the cardinal, and the AP there on the left at the 1st degree of Aries. Okay, so I actually argue especially in terms of mundane astrological research, that we really conceive of this more as a very flexible visual range. So really, going beyond that 4-degree window, I think, is more interesting. And when I actually expanded that to about 10 degrees, I captured a lot more interesting stuff, especially related to a lot of those themes we'll be going over today. So I really do argue that we should expand it, even perhaps in natal chart interpretation. But I do find that narrowing that a bit in natal charts is maybe a little bit more exact in that sense, or can be a little bit more precise. But who knows? We'll look over a lot of examples, and we might have a different conception of that. So basically 25 mutable to 5 cardinal would be that 10-degree window, and we'll see a lot of examples where that seems to play out pretty well. And I also include moving alignments, and what I mean by that, and I'll be talking about that a little bit throughout, which is simply an alignment that has already exacted at a specific degree area of the zodiac, or will exact, but hasn't yet, and those planets are very close. And due to retrogradation, they're moving close together over a certain area, in this case, over the Aries point. And our first example will illustrate that pretty well. So the significance, as I said, you can use the AP in any zodiac model you want. For example, Richard Tarnas, in his book Cosmos and Psyche, he eliminates the zodiac entirely from his research, and he just focuses on the planetary archetypes. And so in that kind of like archetypal astrology research, you can definitely add the Aries point, because it really is just an astronomical axis. And that's interesting to study. Is this basically a significant area of the zodiac, and does it have some symbolic reflection, meaning, correlation? So it just adds another layer when we're studying world transits to compare and contrast with others that don't occur on the Aries point, and is there something there? So basically that brings me to my research question, which we're going to explore today. Is there a meaningful pattern or underlying archetype to AP alignments? And if so, what is it? So future significance on this really quickly, we do have a Saturn-Neptune conjunction coming up very soon. It will exact February 20th, 2026 at exactly 0 degrees, well, not exactly, but on 0 degrees of Aries and 45 zodiacal minutes. And in fact, that will be coming in very strongly next year, because they will be at that moving alignment that I was mentioning. They'll be very close in orb and moving across the Aries point before they actually exact. And then following that, in 2032, we have a Saturn-Uranus conjunction that will cross from Gemini to Cancer, and it's in that 4-degree window as well, 28 Gemini, and then we'll cross the AP from Cancer. And these are just charts of those alignments. This is Saturn-Neptune, and this is the Uranus-Saturn conjunction. Okay, so far, so my first introduction to the Aries point actually occurred through the work of Noel Thiele. And this was actually very early in my astrological studies, which is now almost 20 years, way back when in the early 2000s. And Thiele was really interested in this from his influence from Uranian astrology. So this was a school of thought of astrology, a whole technique paradigm that emerged in the 1920s and 30s. And this is really where we get, midpoint theory and the 90-degree dial from. And the Aries point is actually pretty important. It was very much emphasized in Uranian work. And so Thiele was very much inspired by that. He was really interested in midpoints. In fact, he did stress looking at midpoints aligning or hitting the Aries point as well. So that expands the natal chart significance of it. He argued that the AP was every being's connection to the larger world, and that the potential of public projection for the person in terms of the planet point or midpoint configured with it. And this is a very common idea amongst a lot of astrologers, that there's somehow this kind of catalyzing effect from it, that the planet that hits the Aries point is kind of pushed out into the world, whether it likes it or not. It's like there's some sort of fate or destiny, if you will. Although, a lot of astrologers do stress that it is a potentiality, right? It's not something that the person will manifest or has to manifest. And of course, more so from an evolutionary point of view, right, that would be more under the domain of free will. Robert Hand had this conception as well. He said it represents, in horoscope symbols, he said it represents the most impersonal, but also the widest social contacts, one's relationship to the larger world. So there is this kind of transpersonal dimension that's conceived in relation to it, that it brings the individual out to the larger collective field in some way, or it's a vehicle for that in some way, and this potential for fame. And I like to be careful in not aggrandizing this, especially in natal readings. I really like to ask a lot of questions and kind of see how that's expressing itself. And as we'll see in the next astrologer's example, this isn't always, super fame. It's not it can just also just be in one's local community. It can be within one's social group or the small networks they're a part of, just notable for something. It doesn't have to be this, famous person basically because of that. And of course, lots of people will have AP placements that will not express that in their life, right? Kathy Rose is another astrologer that works a lot with the AP. She actually uses it with solar arcs, which I think is really interesting. And that expands how you could use it even with like secondary progressions. You could see when does a progressed planet or a solar arc planet hit the AP and what's happening in the life. And does that, connect with that symbolism? She argued that, she called it the bloom zone, and said that the AP brings about a culmination of expression that's directed and catalyzed into the world, and particularly into larger public or collective awareness. And she uses a lot of examples actually where, it's somebody coming out to their local community or to their family or friend group even. So it's not always, the larger collective, but it can just be like something is culminating, something's coming out in the open. Maybe it's like a creative project they've been working on and they reveal it, like a book project or something, and they announce it, or there's some announcement made or something, especially with those timed like progressions or solar arcs. It's like a period of a time when they're bringing something outward, right? So we see this very catalytic effect from it that seems to be consistent amongst a lot of astrologers. Eric Francis is another notable astrologer that's worked a lot with the AP, and actually more so in mundane astrology. I used to actually write for Planet Waves back in the day, so very familiar with his views of this. And he said very much that the AP was connected with events with strong influence on personal and global affairs. So it had these kind of events that happen on the AP or connect to the AP have this kind of global ramifications, this kind of dispersive, widespread effect. And very famously has this quote that the AP reminds us that the personal is political, that every individual is connected to a larger public life. So a lot of the events that Francis attributed with it or discussed in some of his work, look to the way that these types of events, and we'll see examples of this that I'll share, that these events really, they sort of remind us that we're inevitably involved in political matters, that these things will affect you no matter who you are and will affect your life, and you can't just kind of sit back. And so they have this kind of call to action sometimes, that they involve things that are very politically complex and end up kind of calling people to, involve themselves in activism and involving themselves in the larger community. So again, we do see this very transpersonal dimension even from Francis's conception. Okay, so we'll come back to all this in the conclusion, and we'll synthesize a lot of these ideas in relation to the work that I'll share. So my first example is, I want to start with William Lilly. So Lilly was a 17th century astrologer who was actually pretty well known in his time. And he's most well known to us actually for being, for publishing Christian Astrology, which is basically the textbook for horary astrology. And Lilly was very, very good at horary. And he had some pretty interesting techniques and made a lot of really interesting predictions in his time. In fact, one of them was predicting the London fire. And he was actually investigated for that because they thought he was involved somehow because he accurately predicted it happening. And Lilly's book is also it's critical actually because it was published in English. And that was actually really rare during the medieval period because most works were published in Latin or Arabic. In fact, astrology was flourishing in the Middle East and amongst Persian astrologers. And he was drawing a lot from that work as well. And there was a lot of cross-pollination between England. So again, Lilly is an English astrologer living in England. But it's really thriving. Actually, astrology is at its peak really in the Middle East. So there's a lot of transmission from that. And you can see that in the sources he's citing and a lot of the ideas that he has, which is a part of this, my first example. So what I want to stress here is actually this image. This is a front piece engraving from his book, Christian Astrology. And you can find this in any reprint of the book. In fact, there's a free copy on the Internet Archive you can find. And there's a lot of symbolic context in this image, which is really interesting. But I want to focus on the top left-hand corner, outside the window, basically. And if you look into the sky, there is a conjunction depicted there. And as you can see, there are 3 zodiac signs, Taurus, Aries, and Pisces. And this alignment, this conjunction, is a Jupiter-Saturn alignment that actually exacted at 25 Pisces. But as I was talking about the moving alignment, it actually moved across the AP during this period of time. So it exacted in 1643 and moved across the Aries Point. Now, I do want to stress that it doesn't seem that Lilly was really focused on the Aries Point at all and really had any, noted it really. He was actually very fixated on its occurrence in Pisces. And this had a lot of cosmological religious meaning at the time, and we'll talk about that. But also interesting was this conjunction correlated with the start of the English Civil War, and we'll get into that in a minute. So this is what I'm focusing on here. It's just this conjunction, and it's depicted in this image right on that border, right on that border of Pisces and Aries. But it did exact actually at 25. So that's in my 10-degree window. But even if you don't buy that 10-degree window, they were very close in orb, as we'll see, crossing the AP. So here's a zoomed in image of that. And they're depicted as, stars. And this was also really significant cosmologically for Lilly because he was a Christian. And there was actually a common belief that this was like a Saturn-Jupiter conjunction was the Star of Bethlehem, that this correlated with the birth of Christ, even Muhammad. So a lot of prophets were believed to have been born under specifically Saturn-Jupiter alignments in Pisces. Okay, so here's a chart just of that exact conjunction. That was February 24th, 1643. And you can see they are exacting at 25 Pisces. And also note the nodes crossing the AP axis there. That's going to be significant. We'll see a lot of examples of that. There was also a total solar eclipse shortly after that. That occurred right on the Aries Point 29 Pisces, March 20th, 1643. Very interesting. And here is the next day of that eclipse. And I just want to show this to show that kind of moving alignment visual, right? We can see Saturn at 28 Pisces, Jupiter right on the Aries point, straddling that sun on the solstice, on the equinox, and the moon's out of the way. So you can see how they're really close, right? And they're moving over the Aries point. Jupiter's there. So to me, this is an Aries point activation. So this is something that I really noticed a lot in my research is looking at it as all of this is a very dynamic process, looking beyond just the timing of an event, but around it, what just happened to the Aries point before, like the weeks or even a month or so before. And you'll notice things like retrogradation going on, an eclipse happening. There's and a lot of reiterating symbols too. And that's what I think is really important to pay attention to. Also, no Eris is there. She hangs out for quite a while in places. But interestingly, it does seem to correlate, be crossing the AP during these very critical moments that I'm talking about, which is interesting. Okay, the Saturn-Jupiter cycle is very complicated. So if any of this is new to you, I definitely recommend kind of going back over it and so forth. But I'm going to run through this pretty quickly. So this is actually a cycle that was really significant in the medieval period. In fact, that seems to be where its significance entirely comes from, and mostly from medieval Persian astrologers. So they were really tracking these cycles, which makes sense. At the time, Saturn and Jupiter were the longest cycles, orbits around the sun at the time. So they didn't have outer planets. So these conjunctions, you could track really long range periods of time. So these conjunctions happen every 20 years, and then they occur in signs of the same element for about a 242-year period. And these were referred to as trigons. So we'll see some quotes from Lilly. He refers to trigons. That's what he's talking about, is these conjunctions reoccurring over a 242-year period every 20 years in the same element. So they'd occur in fire, earth, water, air. So it would cycle, these conjunctions would cycle through all the elements, all the signs, and then the cycle would repeat every 960 years. So this was like a roughly, almost a 1,000 millennial long cycle. And so again, this significance stems from primarily from medieval Persian astrologers. And so after these 242-year periods would cycle, right? So they would end and then change to a new element. These were considered by many medieval astrologers to be really significant shifts in political and religious power. And so they would very specifically refer to these as shifts and changes in dynasty that would happen, and mostly, involving the monarchies and the theocratic systems that they had at the time, right? So Lilly, he's looking at this, he's depicting this in his book, and note that he published this. I'm gonna go back really quick. He published this book, right, in 1687, right? So this is long after this conjunction happens. So he's depicting this in hindsight, which is important to consider, because this had a lot of political significance and religious significance, because this was this was perceived as a very apocalyptic shift. This was the renewal of that cycle. And when, prophets would emerge and these dynastic changes would occur, basically. According to Nicholas Campion in his book, Astrology and Cosmology in the World's Religions, he said that Persian conjunctional theory, referring to the Saturn-Jupiter cycle, allowed nothing less than a full description and analysis of God's unfolding plan. So this was a way, this also shows a way in which astrology was very much adapted to the Christian worldview, even with Islam. and even Judaism. There was a lot of cross-pollination between these ideas and philosophical debates going on. And astrology really adapted itself to those worldviews. And as I said, the renewal of the cycle was thought to correlate with the rise of prophets. So Christ and Muhammad were thought to emerge specifically under those conjunctions in Pisces. Abu Mashar, who wrote a huge text, it's pretty much the only text we have in relation to this conjunctional theory that's been translated. He believed that the flood, the deluge, the ancient deluge, occurred under a Pisces alignment in specifically 3101 BCE, although Lilly disagreed with this and thought it happened in Aries. Okay, so this was the final water triplicity alignment before they shifted. Those cycles would shift into fire until the early 1800s. Okay, now I'm going to jump a little ahead, and we'll come back to this in a minute. But then, and again, mind you, this is crossing the AP axis. Okay, so it's not just a triplicity change, but it's also an AP triplicity change. It's crossing the Aries point. So the next transition happens in 1782. Okay, so meaning these conjunctions are occurring then in fire signs for the next 242 years. And then the next transition happens in 1782, and that actually exacts in that 4-degree window at 28 Sagittarius and crosses the AP, also opposes Uranus, which will be significant. We'll see that in a minute. So hold that for a minute. We'll come back to that. So Lilly really did, as I said, perceive this as a very apocalyptic moment in England and really the world. He actually really thought this was perhaps the prelude to kind of the end times, right? In this quote here, this was a pamphlet that he had published in 1644 with a lot of predictions and writings about this conjunction and what would happen. And again, mind you, this is the start of the English Civil War. So he's already seeing a lot of these political changes going on. He's aware of all this stuff happening. But he basically says, this might perhaps be the last conjunction ever in the sign of Pisces. These are unprecedented times. These are there's never been a time quite like this. And he's actually feeling like this could be, maybe the end of the world. He's basically kind of saying this might be the last we shall ever see in this trigon. So very simply, the English Civil War was this conflict. It was a series of conflicts and events of monarchy versus parliament. Okay, so up through the medieval period, right, there's absolutism. There's this divine right of rulership of a bloodline of kings, right? So, kings rule based on their bloodline, supposedly from their divine approval from God, right? And this is an enduring idea throughout the medieval period. And right at this time, we start to see, there's been a lot of political ideals, a lot of philosophy emerging that's challenging this. And it's basically the first time that we see people rising up and actually starting to do something about it. It's like they're trying to change this and start to implement these new, at the time, very radical ideas, which we take for granted today, right? Like constitutionalism, separation of powers, natural human rights, a Bill of Rights, rights of property, even the Second Amendment. These things all emerged out of this period of time and were very heretical. And so actually, as a result of the English Civil War, the monarchy in England, which was the Stuart line, and specifically this was on the right, was King Charles I. He was actually beheaded as a result of this. He was replaced with his brother, Charles II. But after the monarchy, so the monarchy was suspended and replaced with the Commonwealth, but it was restored in 1660, but with modified power. So this was a very significant shift that was just beginning to emerge in the Western world, right? Where the absolutism of the monarchy was really being questioned and really being challenged and actually being modified, right? And its power begins to slowly decline. Even though England is rising in terms of imperialist power at this time, it is sort of the first symbolic signs that something is changing in the collective, right? Democracy, these new ideals, constitutionalism, these are really beginning to emerge. And so this is basically just trying to get more oversight over the king's decisions and this kind of governing body that can basically regulate what the king is deciding, okay? So this has huge implications actually for the American Revolution. So the very political, ideological underpinnings of the English Civil War and much later French Revolution culminated actually right in American independence and the achievement of political sovereignty from monarchical control. I don't want to whitewash American history. Obviously, there's a lot of I know it wasn't freedom for everyone. Obviously, there's a lot of other battles we've had to wage since then. But that is the ideological basis, right, of the American vision, right, of the political system. It is sort of freeing us from this monarchical power, and we can question whether that's been successful or has been replaced with corporations or what have you. But these really powerful ideas, right, in the U.S. Constitution, Bill of Rights, they adopted a lot of ideas, like the Second Amendment came directly out of the English Civil War period. So 1782 is actually so this is the next Saturn-Jupiter conjunction, right? That's shifting from fire to earth. And this crosses the AP and opposes Uranus, which is very interesting. And this is actually the end of the American Revolution. So the Declaration of Independence is already signed. The colonies have already decided they're their own country. They've already been fighting the war. But this year specifically, and 1783 symbolizes, or literally legally, basically defines the America at the time as a sovereign nation and free from monarchical control. And this is when England basically signs the Treaty of Paris. There were lots of treaties of Paris. This is specifically the Treaty of Paris of 1782. And this was drafted on November 30th. But you can see just earlier that month, November 5th, 1782, it was being drafted. The beginnings of that treaty were being formed by a lot of the leaders of the colonies. And then it was signed September 3rd, 1783, the following year. But this whole year, as this conjunction is exacting, is basically the beginnings of this treaty, a lot of negotiations going on between America and the English monarch. And it's finalized the next year. Also note, a lunar eclipse happened on the AP axis. The nodes were also crossing at that time, as it did with the English Civil War. So again, here's the actual day of the signing of the Treaty of Paris. You can even see Saturn in that 10-degree window at 5 Capricorn, still opposing Uranus. So this really was the beginning of the subversion of monarchy. And this had huge implications. Like this, ends up becoming a model, or this new political model emerges over this next period of 242 years, and rises up as a new model of how Western democracies, right, run themselves, right? And it's interesting that Lilly actually kind of sensed this. I mean, here he says, times have no precedence of the like excursion or mutation that I could have ever read of, nor shall the ages and future see the like. It may be justly be doubted, and in an astrological way divine, that there shall be a sensible disturbance, if not a final subversion to those commonwealths and monarchies that had originally their beginning in either 1603, 1623, or near. And he's referencing other Saturn-Jupiter, or Jupiter-Saturn alignments that occurred alongside other dynastic changes amongst that specific monarchy. So he's talking specifically about the Stuart line in England. But I found this quote really interesting because he, seems to be sensing like, there is this subversion going on, and this is something big is happening. And again, he's perceiving this as very apocalyptic. So he's not really predicting, the rise of America as the next world power. But in a way, I find that really interesting, this subversion of monarchy conception that he had. Had something to it. It was a big deal, he felt. So this whole period, so within 2 centuries, this subversion culminated in American independence from monarchical control. America then rises up, right? So this is, that transition is the height of America, the British Empire's global hegemony, and then it begins to wane, and then is actually replaced with America and eventually the United States. So I would really argue that, so those cycles in themselves are really significant. As we see, there's this consistent ideal throughout this period that these sign changes, the renewal of the cycle is a big deal. But I would just add this crossing of the Aries point seems to add something else, like, a huge shift in world power is emerging at this time. And this medieval boundary of absolutism was actually, totally pushed. And a whole new form of governing emerges at this time, basically. Okay, so we're going to leave politics behind, and we're going to go into these 3 themes, so space flight, nuclear technology, computers, and internet and AI. And I'm just going to touch on some key developments in these areas. So we'll start with space flight. And this is actually really critical, especially with these changes in world power, right? Because the United States becomes the predominant world power. And a lot of these technologies are developing during the start of the world wars with these power vying nations, right? So one of the first significant developments in spaceflight is the successful launch of the first liquid-fueled rocket. And this occurred on March 16th, 1926, as Uranus is getting in that 10-degree window and aligning with the sun. And I do want to point out this is a period in which Uranus is going to be crossing the AP axis as liquid fuel rocket technology is developing, right? This is the first successful launch, but it begins to develop as Uranus is crossing the AP itself. And it's just very interesting, the day of it, we have that Sun-Uranus conjunction. Of course, Eris is there as well, right on that AP or coming into that AP window. Robert Goddard, who was actually a physicist, rocket engineer, scientist who developed the first liquid-fueled rocket, born with Jupiter on the Aries Point Axis. We can see right at 1 degree of Cancer. And we'll see this a lot of different types of configurations. Sometimes they're very personal, like the moon there, or the ascendant midheaven, and sometimes more kind of generational. And I do think that's really significant. In fact, Tarnas, pointed that out in his research, that notable figures can sort of embody that larger collective cycle. They can kind of step up and become the embodiment of it. So even without a time chart, I think in this research, it's really interesting to see even these collective configurations activating the AP in relation to these figures. The next interesting thing is the formation of JPL. So fast forward a bit to 1936, interestingly, Halloween. And that might be interesting in relation to the next chart we'll talk about. But so JPL is a US jet propulsion laboratory, and this was really critical in World War II. Okay, and interestingly, we see the nodes beginning to cross over the AP at this time, or the axis, and we see Jupiter beginning to cross over the AP as it's formed, and as the rocket technology they were developing at the time is getting off the ground, literally. Jack Parsons is a really interesting figure, actually very critical involved in the formation of JPL. He was actually a Thelemite, an occultist, a follower of Crowley, and very into astrology and tarot and sex magic, and fascinating life. There's been tons of TV series adaptations about his life, and was quite an interesting character. Interestingly, invented the first rocket engine to use castable composite rocket propellant. So this technology, or this kind of fuel, went beyond the first liquid fuel rockets and was a composite mixture, and actually allowed for rockets to go much further. So this was very critical in further developments of rocket technology, getting better weapons, of course, and eventually to space flight. Interesting, you can see Saturn-Jupiter conjunction right on the Aries Point Axis, square his moon in that Aries Point Axis, 10-degree window with Eris as well. Interestingly, Jack Parsons died tragically, actually blowing himself up in his laboratory. And it was interesting, I actually found this last night. So it was less than a week, it was July 17th that this accident happened in his lab. There's a lot of controversy over whether he was killed. He had a lot of involvement with the government, and there was a lot of stuff with him. But interestingly, that happened July 17th. July 22nd, there was a new moon conjunct Venus right on the Aries Point Axis following that, which was just really interesting and kind of weird. We can also see Saturn, kind of there a little bit. And so that's also an example, I would say, of a bit of the shadow of the Aries Point. We'll talk about that, or a good example of that. Pushing boundaries a little too far, maybe. So the next stage is the V2 rocket launch. So this occurs on June 20th, and just so happens the first successful V2 rocket launch happens on the day of a new moon on the Aries Point, so 29 degrees of Gemini there, conjunct Saturn right on the Aries Point axis, Venus there too, and Neptune there. Notice there's also a Saturn-Neptune square. So this is part of a Saturn-Neptune cycle. And this is the height of World War II. This is the height of the final solution. This is the height of the genocide going on in Europe as a result of the Nazi regime. The Nazis actually developed this rocket, and this is a Nazi rocket launch. And a lot of Aries Point activation. Werner von Braun, who was the scientist actually pretty responsible for the V2 rocket, was working with the Nazis, who was from Poland, and lots of Aries Point placements here. We have the sun. He was born, interestingly, March 23rd, and you'll see this as well, a lot of consistencies with these key figures being born around equinoxes and solstices. We also see Pluto crossing the AP, his ascendant even getting into that 10-degree window. And Werner von Braun actually was a traitor to the Nazis. He actually ended up escaping and coming to the US and then helped the United States develop these rockets. The V2 rocket was really significant because it was the first long-range guided ballistic missile. It did a lot of damage, killed a lot of people, unfortunately. But it was also the first human-made object to enter space, to breach what was called the Kármán line, or the edge of space. And that's basically just a legal boundary of space. It's not really super clearly defined. It's basically just the furthest a rocket had been to that point. But interestingly, Theodore von Kármán, who came up with that idea, was born with Mars on the Aries Point itself, 29 Pisces, very interestingly, conjunct Sedna, also a very slow-moving planet. The first satellite launch, Sputnik 1, this was launched by the USSR at the time, October 4th, 1957. Not a lot of impressive stuff going on the day of the launch. However, as we'll see, it follows a lot of very interesting AP activation. You can see Mercury there in that 10-degree window, Mars, Sun, Jupiter just left. But just before, August 27th, just a month before, right, we have this interesting clustering of planets. And in fact, Mercury stationed retrograde in that 10-degree window at 25 Virgo, and Jupiter was crossing the AP at that time. And we'll return to this with the moon landing, which is interesting. The first human flight, this is the first human being in space. This is Yuri Gagarin, who was Russian, and he was launched on Vostok 1. And this is the launch chart itself. You can find this on Astro Data Bank, pretty accurately timed chart. And again, not hugely interesting AP stimulation. We do see the Mercury there. We do see the midheaven coming into the AP axis. But do note the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction, and I'll come back to that in a second. But it's an interesting synchronicity there. Mars on the ascendant, also interesting. Yuri himself, his chart, this has a B rating. The timing doesn't, a Rodin reading, the timing doesn't really matter as much. I'm just kind of pointing out here Mars at 25 Pisces, so getting in that 10-degree window, conjunct Eris, straddling the Aries point. So first human in space, okay. His ascendant also is Scorpio, so ruler of the chart, Mars. The Apollo 8 launch, so fast forward to 1968, and this is the first human orbit around the moon, successful, right? So they send a human being around the moon and they return. And I mean, look at this. This is just a remarkable AP activation. The sun, again, right, we see the winter solstice at 29 Sag, Mercury even a little outside that window. The nodes are there, right? And this whole era is huge. Also, right, because of the Uranus-Pluto conjunction, which is a huge symbolic factor to all of this as well. And I'm simply just arguing, does the AP add something a little extra, like, shooting us to the moon, to say. Chiron there, the nodes, right? And there's also a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction exacting in 68 and 69, okay? There's also an annular solar eclipse, March 16th, 1969, so the next year, leading up to the moon landing. And lots of AP activation here. The Jupiter-Uranus conjunction is a moving alignment. It's coming to its exact, but they're moving retrograde over that. There was a penumbral lunar eclipse, September. So just to show this, eclipse activation, even Mercury retrograding over the AP that year as well. So this culminates, right, in sending two humans, two men to the moon on the Apollo 11 mission. And this is really one of the most stunning AP synchronicities because the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, which, Tarnas attributed to these technological, scientific breakthroughs, huge breakthroughs in of itself, this exacted right as this mission was taking place, right between those dates, July 16th and 24th, it was exacting right opposite the AP at 0 Libra. Very interesting. The Stonewall riot. So these are just some peripheral stuff going on, right? Again, the late 60s is just a hugely dynamic, changing time. Lots of revolution going on. This is basically the symbolic birth of the modern LGBTQ+ movement. The Pride Parade tradition comes out of memorializing the Stonewall riots the next year. And this is just a series of riots that took place in New York against a lot of horrific laws that were implemented actually during the Cold War. So a lot of laws in New York actually banned gay men, lesbian women from holding hands in public, cross-dressing, even kissing. They had to gather in these clubs owned by the mafia, actually. So this was just kind of a point in which they were fed up with all of that and began to fight back against police, which would frequently raid these places. And there was often a lot of violence and beating and harassment that was going on. But yeah, just look at this clustering on the AP. And interestingly, a full moon was culminating and crossed over the AP. It didn't exact there, but it was, culminating over it when the Stonewall riots took place. The Woodstock Music Festival, I would say also a hugely significant event that really created the template for the modern music festival and has become, basically a tradition worldwide now. And they really, I would say, this was a huge experiment. This was thousands of people, young people mostly, a lot of them on drugs, peacefully gathering. There were a lot of drug overdoses, but overall it was very peaceful, not any violence. Everything kind of worked out, and interestingly, the first performance was Richie Haven, who performed at 5:07 p.m. that day, August 15th. And we see the AP on the ascendant coming in there. And there's also some debate of when it actually started. There's an opening ceremony earlier in the day. But anyway, just some other additional historical events. Of course, Woodstock wouldn't have been Woodstock without the chemists that brought us LSD, which was a huge catalyst, I would argue, for a lot of the countercultural revolution that was going on at this time. Interestingly, Hoffman born with the AP on all angles, Mercury conjunct Uranus on the AP over there on the descendant. And yeah, very interesting setup there. Bicycle Day, which was basically the first intentional LSD trips. This is when Hoffman experimented on himself. And he actually accidentally dosed himself a few days before and didn't know if that's what actually caused the visual effects that he was having, perceptual changes. So he went back to his lab and actually took a very small amount and was, astonished that it worked at such small amounts. And he recorded this actually in his book, LSD, My Problem Child. In his journal, he recorded the time as 4:20, very interestingly, April 19th, 1943. And this is his famous bicycle ride home. He was accompanied by a friend and did make it there safely. In fact, they said very timely, faster than usual. And we can see, as he's taking his first dose, the AP coming into that 10-degree window coming into the angles there. Neptune crossing the AP at this time, very interesting. And again, this is the 1940s. This is leading up to the end of World War II. There's bombs being developed, missiles, there's the final solution, just a very interesting boundary pushing period of time, I would argue. And Neptune rising. Okay, now fast forward to 1981, we have the Columbia STS-1. This is the first crewed mission or shuttle that was designed to go into space and return a crew back and forth, okay? And it did so very successfully many times. This is the first launch of the Columbia. And this, interestingly, look at that date, April 12th, 1981, and look at that Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, or Jupiter-Saturn conjunction on the AP axis there. And that is actually the same date, as the first human flight, Vostok 1 with Yuri Gagarin. And very interestingly, according to NASA, this was a coincidence. They said that they intended to launch a few days before, but because of technical difficulties, which is very common in the rocket world, they were forced to launch on this day, which ended up being the anniversary of the first human flight. So this is like sending groups of people to space and back, right? And, while the first human flight didn't have a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction on the AP, it's just an interesting synchronicity. Same date, Saturn-Jupiter conjunction. I thought that was fascinating. The Columbia missions tragically ended, unfortunately, in 2003 with the Columbia STS-107. This was the, tragic accident where the shuttle crashed on re-entry in Texas. Everyone on board died, unfortunately. And I mean, look at this, the angles. This is a very accurately timed launch chart for that mission. And we see anaretic angles, a lot of instability, mutable anaretic. We also see the AP axis on all angles. Mercury was retrograde, did not cross the AP, but look at the moon, also Saturn getting into the AP window as well. 1984, Reagan's State of the Union address. This correlates with a very interesting conjunction on the AP involving Jupiter, Venus, Neptune, right at 0 degrees. This is basically the State of the Union address where he directs NASA to begin construction of the International Space Station. And this is what a lot of this is building up to, right? Getting crewed missions back and forth to some sort of space station that would be a kind of, stopping point. And this was also a very idealistic vision, right? This was, getting the world nations to gather around a common interest space. And also, interestingly, of course, Reaganomics, trickle-down economics, which is also referred to today by a lot of academics, journalists, activists as neoliberalism, or as the philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls hyper-capitalism. It's this sort of, beyond end-stage capitalism that we are experiencing today, with a lot of the state is invested in just regulating the market and pumping a lot of money upward, and basically has resulted in a lot of power in corporations, taking over regulatory agencies and so on and so forth. Anyway, this is the start of that. This is really the birth of that political economic ideology as well. And Reagan, in his State of the Union, really addresses this. He's saying, he's looking at space not just as a scientific or medical for medical breakthroughs, scientific breakthroughs, but also the next frontier of commerce, right? He's saying, trying to promote private sector investment in space. And this, in some ways, has come true, right? SpaceX, Elon Musk, like him or hate him, but SpaceX has actually been very successful. It is pretty much the first very successful privatized space missions that have been going on. This is the first successful launch of Falcon 1, which is the first successful rocket. There was a few failed attempts. And this occurred, interestingly, March 24th, 2006, as Pluto is crossing the AP axis and following a new moon. It didn't exact in that 10-degree window, but again, the moon was, crossing the AP as it's coming to new moon, the day of the launch. Again, lots of other cycles, Saturn, Uranus, you can see too, going on. Also, this is coming to the height of the global financial crisis. And I thought this was just really interesting, right? So we had that very idealistic Neptune, Venus, Jupiter, right? All the idealistic planets lining up in Capricorn. And then here are the consequences, I would say, of a lot of that, turning the other way to letting a lot of powerful people with a lot of money do whatever they want and ransack the country, basically, right? Pluto gets there and it's like wake up call time, right? And this, interestingly, right, that whole crisis correlates with Pluto transitioning from Sag to Capricorn and crossing the AP axis, or the height of that. Right, so the investigative commission that looked into this, basically concluded this was due to Wall Street, right, putting the financial system on a collision course with crisis, systemic breaches of accountability and ethics of all levels. So a lot of pushing the boundaries of ethics and accountability that led to that. 24 million Americans losing homes due to foreclosures, lots of people who had pretty stable lives, sleeping on couches, living in the streets. Really crazy time. Okay, now the latest missions of SpaceX is the Falcon 9. And this was actually a chart for the first launch of that. That was June 4th, 2010. And this has actually become the most successful rocket in history, and also has the highest safety record. So there's been 351, as of 2022, successful and safe rocket launches out of 354. So this is really getting further to getting a rocket going back and forth, sending missions back and forth to space safely and effectively, right? And I mean, look at this very amazing AP stimulation on the first day of this launch, or the first successful one. And we also see Jupiter and Uranus, right, on the AP this year, which mirrors, right, that moon landing on the other end over in Libra, where Saturn is at. Okay, so nuclear technology. Just gonna check time. I think we're good. So I know this is a lot. I'm just gonna kind of skim through a bunch of examples here. So the first formal discovery of nuclear fission, this is basically, this is due to experiments. They're actually bombarding uranium with neutrons or neutrinos, basically, and discover the splitting that occurs of the uranium atom, basically splitting into two nuclei. So this is the formal discovery of a nuclear fission, not creating a nuclear chain reaction, which will eventually lead to nuclear power. But they notice that this split creates a lot of energy. So this is where they finally discover that, wow, we can use experimentation to manipulate these particles and we can generate energy. And the manuscript is, when the manuscript was sent, so this was being sent for peer review and publication December 22nd, interestingly, the solstice, 1938, was considered the formal or symbolic discovery of nuclear fission. So it had happened before, of course, they had written it, but they were submitting it for peer review publication. And it just happened to be the day of a new moon right on the AP axis, also squaring Eris. Mercury retrograde, also Mercury had just before, earlier that month, December 3rd, retrograded over that exact point where that new moon would take place. Very interesting. The actual atom split, so the first successful sustained nuclear chain reaction happened at University of Chicago. This is an accurately timed chart. So this is known as the atom split chart. And this is what leads eventually to the atomic bomb, to nuclear energy. And we see Neptune crossing the AP in that day in time. The moon crossing that as well, opposing Eris. Very interesting. Robert Oppenheimer, the so-called father of the atomic bomb, a recent movie made about him, which is really interesting. Born, not a lot of personal stuff going on here, but very interesting in terms of collective, manifestation. We see the nodes in the AP. We see a Uranus-Neptune conjunction, very dynamic, occurring over the AP axis. The Trinity test, this was the result of Oppenheimer's work, and this was the first detonation of an atomic bomb. Happened July 16th, 1945 in New Mexico. And we see the AP right on the midheaven. We see Jupiter, Chiron, Neptune clustering. And again, this is, the same correlating with a lot of things going on in 1940s at the end, the height of World War II. And this is interesting. This is not connected to the AP, but I just wanted to point this out. Just before so like a week before the Trinity test, July 9th, there was a total solar eclipse, interestingly, that aligned with the ascendant of the Trinity test chart. The synchronicity is really fascinating. And that was actually visible over the US, by the way. So there were definitely some signs, something was going on, something brewing, some boundaries being pushed. Okay, yeah, just to show another lunar eclipse that occurred 1945, so that those nodes crossing the AP, so just more activation stimulation going on. Okay, so World War II, culminated in, what's argued whether this was actually what ended it or not, or could have been avoided. But yes, the very tragic dropping of two horrific bombs on the Japanese population, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this happened over 2 different days in August 1945. And we can see Neptune, Chiron, Jupiter, clustering on the AP, squaring Venus that day, over those days. Very interesting. So again, you can see this is also similar, right? Building up to Bicycle Day, right? Acid coming into consciousness, coming into the world, LSD, Neptune crossing that AP. So much boundaries, I would argue, being pushed. So the first electricity generated from a reactor occurs December 20th, interestingly, the solstice. That was an experimental reactor in Idaho known as EBR-1. And that occurred on December 20th, 1951. We see the sun conjunct Chiron, the AP, Jupiter over the AP square. Interesting. Obninsk, maybe pronouncing that wrong. This is in the USSR at the time. This is the first nuclear power plant to generate electricity and supply it to a grid. And interestingly, occurred within these days, June 26th, 27th, 1954, as the sun's crossing the AP. And Mars is interestingly retrograding over the AP axis. Jupiter there as well. Calder Hall, this is in England, actually, or in the UK. This is the first nuclear power station to supply power commercially, and interestingly correlated with the Mercury retrograde cycle over the AP. Not a lot of stunning lineups, but that, again, something happening on the AP. So this is really the biggest so-called disaster in nuclear history, or nuclear power plant history. And that's the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster that occurred March 11, 2011. And the very interesting lineup here. Again, we see the nodes, right? Eclipse activity. And this was a result of the Great East Japan earthquake. So there was a earthquake and tsunami, and that's what led to the meltdown of a few reactors there. And actually has led to the dumping of like 400 tons of radionucleotides into the Pacific Ocean for decades. They cannot stop that now. So it's been decommissioned, and yeah, so lots of radiation going into the ocean will likely bioaccumulate up the food chain. Uranus, very interestingly, crossing the AP. In fact, 1 zodiacal minute from moving over it. It had already passed twice, so it had done its retrogradation dance, but was its final crossing over the AP, right when that earthquake happened. And note Jupiter also, there was a Jupiter, that was that 2010, 2011 Jupiter-Uranus conjunction that was going on. So yeah, very interesting. Also interesting, the Fukushima Daiichi power plant opened on March 26, 1971. And that just happened to be the day of a new moon, right, in the AP window, that 10-degree window that I argue we should look into. Also, Pluto crossing the AP. Okay, computer technology and the internet. So, Joseph Marie Jacquard is actually the inventor of the Jacquard loom. This is like a very formative step towards getting to modern computers. And this is actually it's a mechanical device actually that he invents that actually revolutionizes the textile industry. This is the Jacquard loom. And actually his loom ends up being the inspiration for modern computers eventually, okay? He uses like this punch card system, and this is a way of actually programming a loom to make specific types of fabrics like damasks and really complex types of weaves. And interestingly, right, we see Jupiter, Mercury, Venus all in the AP window there. This is a Jacquard loom, what it looked like. And again, very revolutionary in terms of pushing the boundaries of textiles and what was possible in terms of mass production. Charles Babbage, who built a lot from Jacquard, and he created a conceptual model of a computer actually with a central CPU. His analytical engine, basically. And this is also another very formative step to getting us closer to modern computers. Interestingly, Sun, Mars, a little bit, in that 10-degree window, but in the AP, not a time chart. Ada Lovelace, she's considered actually the first computer programmer, and she wrote algorithms for the analytical engine. She was friends with Babbage. And interestingly, the moon in the AP axis, we also see the midheaven in the AP axis, and this is an AA time chart, by the way. So the next really big leap in computers comes with Alan Turing, also a gay man. Fun fact. And he really pushes the boundaries of what's possible in understanding or getting to making modern computers possible. And that is through the publication of his book or his paper on computational numbers that he published in 1937. And this is considered the theoretical foundation of modern computer science, okay? And in this, he defines an algorithm and solves a lot of major problems that were unsolvable before he got into them, right? And we see Venus, Pluto, Sun, right, born on the solstice there, Sun at 1 degree Cancer, big cluster there, AP activation. So there's a lot of steps to getting to the modern computer, and I've picked out some of them, and there's a lot of interesting AP alignments with them. So this is considered the first electronic digital computer. It was known as the ABC computer, and that was the Antonosoff-Berry computer. And the prototype of this was built September through November of 1939. And as you can see, there's this interesting, Jupiter-Neptune opposition. Neptune is beginning to cross over the AP there as modern digital electronic computers are being developed, and Jupiter crossing there. The Z3, this was a German computer that was developed in 1941. It was the first programmable digital electronic computer, and that was released May 12th, 1941. We see the nodes getting there. Also note a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction as well, happening not in the AP, but just an interesting side note. So yeah, eclipse activity going on, Neptune crossing. Konrad Zuse, who was the inventor of the Z3, very stunning AP setup in his untime chart. And the moon, well, we don't really know where the moon would have fit there. Of course, it could have been, a little bit out there. But anyway, regardless, Jupiter squaring Pluto, and actually just set this for noon, where he was born. So yeah, Pluto, Sun, born right on the solstice, Jupiter there. The Colossus Mark II, this was the first fully programmable electronic digital computer that helped decipher and intercepted radio teleprinter messages during World War II. So this was very helpful actually in combating the Nazis, developed by the United States. And interestingly, this was released for government use on June 1st, 1944. with a Mars or a Moon-Neptune conjunction on the AP, Saturn also crossing the AP axis there. And this is also, again, coming into that Saturn-Neptune square, that cycle that we are coming into soon. Tommy Flowers, he was the inventor of that, or very critically involved in the development of the Colossus. Interestingly, born on the winter solstice, conjunct Uranus in the AP window. Okay, so there's a lot of stages to the modern transistor, and this, of course, is a huge step to getting us to, our handheld smartphones, the computers that were being developed at this time we now have in our pockets, way even more sophisticated, actually. And that is a result of transistors, right? Where we've managed to get transistors smaller and smaller and smaller and more condensed into small spaces so we can create these very fast computers, right, that are handheld and small devices. This is a major breakthrough in getting to modern computer technology. This date is considered the sort of discovery or the announcement of the transistor. So it's like the transistor coming into consciousness is being demonstrated for scientists. Basically, there's a lot of stages to get there. But very interestingly, this date is kind of memorialized as like the birth of the transistor. And right, day of the solstice, Mercury coming into that window, Uranus coming into the window there. The founding of Microsoft happened on April 4th, 1975. We see a Jupiter-Mercury conjunction on the AP that day. Interestingly, Bill Gates doesn't really have any AP stimulation. I was kind of surprised by that, just side note. Apple Inc., the founding of Apple, happened on April 1st, 1976, alongside the release of their first product, the Apple I. And again, not hugely interesting, but Mars actually had completed a retrograde over the AP axis. So this is like coming out of that window after it had actually retrograded. Station retrograde right on the AP the year before, so in November 1975. Interesting. The Apple I, this was basically just an 8-bit motherboard. It was not, didn't have a screen or anything, was not really, comparable to a modern computer, or a personal computer at least. Venus right in that window. Again, Pluto had crossed the AP. Steve Wozniak, interestingly, has a lot of AP stimulation, all his angles. And this is a very accurately timed chart. So we have the AP in all angles, the nodes there as well. Steve Jobs, not hugely impressive AP alignment, but do note the nodes on there. And this is interesting too, because when the iPhone, we'll talk about that, gets released, Pluto is crossing his north node at that time. The IBM PC, this is another really big step to actually popularizing personal computers. This is the world's first microcomputer, released August 17th, 1981. And we see a Saturn-Jupiter conjunction. This is also the same year as the Columbia shuttle launch. So we're seeing a lot of parallels in time, right? A lot of different types of, I would say, boundaries being pushed, breakthroughs happening. And again, this is also a Saturn-Jupiter conjunction, right? So very significant in terms of power dynamic changes going on in the world. The Apple Macintosh, this is getting much closer to the model for modern personal computers, or it is the model, right? This is the very beginnings of the modern personal computer that we all know and love. And right alongside, you remember, right, this was the same, in fact, the day after the Reagan State of the Union address, right, that directed the construction of the Universal Space Station. Apple releases the Macintosh, which becomes a beloved product for many, many years. Interestingly, there's this commercial. I don't know if anyone had seen this. You can find this on YouTube. And it was actually a reference to George Orwell's 1984. And it was this computer was released in 1984. And yeah, I definitely recommend watching it. It's really interesting. And in this commercial, there's basically a bunch of people in a room kind of all staring at the screen, and they're being indoctrinated with propaganda. And this woman comes running in with a sledgehammer, and she is being chased by security guards. And then she, comes into the room and throws the sledgehammer and breaks the screen, and everybody's like broken from their trance. And at the end, there's this guy that talks, and he says, on January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. This was a reference to, the modern computer was going to liberate us, was going to free us from Orwell's, prophetic or vision of this big brother security state apparatus, surveillance state, really, where your thoughts were being read, monitored, everything were doing was being recorded and looked at. Very interestingly, right, this was released the day after Reagan's State of the Union address, just this very idealistic vision, especially of like corporations, right, liberating humanity and being a vehicle for that. So just very poignant reflection of that lineup, I think. Okay, Tim Berners-Lee, he's the inventor of the World Wide Web. So not really the internet per se, but the World Wide Web, which connects the public, right, to the internet. And he was born, interestingly, June 8th, 1955, with a Mercury retrograde over the AP axis. Mars is a little bit out of that window. We see the nodes there as well. This was actually the computer that he used to develop the world's first web server. It's called the Next computer. And interestingly, the Next computer was released October 12th during a Saturn, Uranus, Neptune lineup on the AP and Mars retrograding over the AP. So the World Wide Web was developed during a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction over the AP axis, interestingly. And the peak of this really happened March through December. So March 1989 through December 1990. Very interesting. The first website published by Tim Berners-Lee happened on December 20th, 1990, which basically just articulated the vision of the World Wide Web project. We see Mercury retrograding over the AP. The sun there, of course, right close to the solstice. Interesting. Uranus had recently passed over Venus. The iPhone release. So again, right, this is where Pluto is coming to cross. And as the iPhone new models are being released and just, spreading through the world and becomes really the standard smartphone model, is crossing Steve Jobs' North Node. And interestingly, this is a time chart according to Astro Databank of the formal release of the iPhone, January 9th, 2009. The tail end of the global financial crisis. And we see the moon there too, 29, right, crossing the AP with Mars and Pluto. Okay, so kind of the final, at least current step in computer technology is AI, or mostly really large language models, machine learning, technically not really artificial intelligence per se, but very close to getting to that step, maybe. But very impressive. We have OpenAI. So this is a company that was developed by Elon Musk and other investors and computer scientists and AI experts. And interestingly, this was founded December 11th, 2015, right the day of a new moon. That wasn't in that AP window, but it's just interesting, right? Mercury is there and the new moon exacts, and then the moon, of course, crosses over the AP. And Jupiter is getting into the AP axis. The nodes are there, so we're seeing eclipses, right? In fact, there's a lunar eclipse right on the AP axis, September 27th, 2015, so just before the founding of OpenAI. GPT-3, so this is like the first model to be released to people to use, the first machine learning large language model to be tested on. This was released to developers and organizations June 11th, 2020. And slightly over a week before, there was an annular solar eclipse right on the AP. Very interesting, right at 0 degrees of Cancer. And again, we see the nodes there. Okay, so I do think we have time to go over some additional figures. So yeah, I'm just going to run through some other charts. So these are just kind of sporadic public figures, notable figures from different fields that have AP alignments. So Albert Einstein, very interestingly, does have Mercury-Saturn on the AP, their conjunction. Very famous physicist, relativity, very much changes our conception of physics. Betty Friedan, who's actually very instrumental in second wave feminism. Her book, The Feminine Mystique, is seen as a catalyst for second wave feminism. And interestingly, Venus, as it would be right on the AP axis, what she was most known for. Also square her moon on the AP axis, also an accurately timed chart. Edward Snowden, who I would say shattered Apple's delusion that the internet was going to deliver us from surveillance, is the whistleblower who worked for a contractor that worked with the NSA, who leaked tons of documentation to journalists and revealed this massive security apparatus where the government was basically spying not just on US citizens, but people abroad, and had incredible spying capacities. And not only that, but storing data into servers domestically, and everyone's data was being downloaded basically. Very interesting, has the sun born around the solstice, has the sun on the AP, nodes Mars kind of in that window, right? Neptune crossing. Fred Rogers, very influential in children's television, even public broadcasting, and helping to get funding for public broadcasting. Very notable AP figure, and kind of an activist, really. He really pushed for, public television and a new way of developing children's TV. And Sun, Eris, Uranus conjunction on the AP there. Mr. Rogers. Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a very influential philosopher, very influential in the development of perspectivism, which is a really interesting kind of rising philosophical movement that's really influenced anthropology, actually, and lots of other things. I mean, incredible writings, just tons of work, hugely influential in modern philosophy. And very interestingly, Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in the AP axis, opposing Mercury and Mars over the AP axis. Florence Nightingale, she's basically the founder of modern nursing. We see the Pluto nodes, a Neptune-Uranus conjunction on the AP, T-square going on, not a time chart. Sartre, basically, Jean-Paul Sartre, who is, again, hugely influential philosopher on existentialism, phenomenology, really paves the way for phenomenology in a really big way. Born with Mercury conjunct the sun on the AP, opposing Uranus on the AP. Margaret Atwood, I would say, also a very boundary pushing author who addresses a lot of really complex ideas, especially in relation to modern technology and the shadow of novelty and progress, right? And even totalitarianism touches on a lot of, especially in Handmaid's Tale. Born with a Neptune-Uranus or Neptune-Jupiter opposition with Eris there, of course, on the AP axis. Rosa Parks very famously did not give up her seat to a white person in the white person zone of the bus. Very memorialized as a very critical figure, symbolic act in the fight for African-American civil rights in the United States. And interestingly, Venus is on the AP there, as with Friedan, interestingly, and Pluto getting into the AP axis. RuPaul very famously, basically brings drag into popular culture through RuPaul's Drag Race eventually, but a very interesting life, very boundary pushing figure, really changing, conceptions of gender and what's appropriate and what not appropriate for men or women, and really big part of the gender conversation, but also hugely influential in drag and performance, and really pushing culture to more acceptance of drag, and brought drag to mainstream fame, really. Very interesting. Venus there, interesting, right? Conjunct Jupiter, also ascendant and descendant on the AP. Sigmund Freud, very famously forging the way to our conception of the unconscious mind in psychology. Mars, Jupiter opposition T-square with Saturn on the AP axis. Okay, Simone de Beauvoir, she's also a very influential existential philosopher who is very influential in feminist existentialism, also a friend of Sartre, and born with a Mars Moon conjunction on the AP. Okay, so some quick conclusions from all of this. One of the really consistent themes that really seems to emerge here is this, forging new frontiers, pushing beyond the limitations of imposed boundaries, whether that's physics, culture, biology, political power, perception, right? Even as we saw with the first example of the English Civil War, this was really pushing the political boundaries, and that had huge worldwide ramifications, right? The rise of the United States as a world power really does pave the way to a lot of these huge technologies that were developed as a result of that, that really utterly changed the world, right? So we're seeing, I would argue the AP seems to be this very critical symbolism of changing the boundaries of reality, changing what's possible. We also see this kind of pioneering impulse, I think also in relation to potentially natal chart placement. So this is something to kind of work with and play around with potentially in charts to see. And, this makes sense with Aries, at least from the tropical conception, especially that first degree. The start of spring is that symbolism of some pioneering impulse. That maybe that's a desire within the individual or part of their nature, maybe. But yeah, extending one's reach within the broader world or universe. And then I would add the shadow. We've seen a lot of, some darker examples of AP alignments. Fukushima, Jack Parsons blowing himself up, the dropping of atomic bombs, the creation of the atomic bombs and weapons, the implications of that are huge, right? So the negative consequences of hubris, pushing too far, failing to respect or properly understand natural boundaries or wisdom. So that could be something to also just be mindful of, right? In terms of adding to research or delineations or looking at that in your chart, the charts of clients. Does that shadow come up, and is that a potential? And events as well. So that brings me to, again, back to the individual. I would say we can extrapolate a lot of this symbolism and work to try to apply it a little bit more to natal chart placements to see how it works. This kind of reaching out to the broader community, public. This was, very well established by earlier astrologers, Keeley, Hand, Kathy Rose. Even this idea does seem to be consistent of, the individual having this kind of transpersonal mission, even really challenging imposed boundaries. It seems to be a really big theme. So there is this very, similar to like Uranus and rebellious kind of nature quality to it that I think can be, interchangeable or even seen with a lot of other things. Maybe Mars on the ascendant would have that, or a strong Mars placement would have similarities, or a strong Uranus could have similarities here. So there does seem to be this, boundary pushing kind of effect that I think has been consistent. And also this kind of dispersive effect or impact on the world in some way, or one's local community or family or friend group, or some, major impact in some way that they have. So just to kind of conclude the mundane significance, I would say, alignments on the AP do seem to reflect the emergence of events that have kind of widespread significance for humanity and civilization. These do seem to be very critical turning points in pushing the boundaries of what civilization can do and become. So again, extending our collective reach into a wider field of possibility. I would also say, and this is building a lot from Kathy Rose, this conception of a culmination or coming into collective view of something. It's like the blossoming and the bloom zone, I think does seem to be relevant, because a lot of these discoveries that I talked about and things, it's like they were already happening behind the scenes. And then when they come into the collective consciousness, it's like they're being revealed during those AP activations. So it's like we could also see these things going on already, and then it comes into the collective consciousness under those. It's like coming into the world in some way of some sort of boundary pushing potential or discovery. And then I would say this is also kind of, building from Francis's conception of this, large global impacts, these kind of wide-reaching effects of these types of events that are reflected alongside these alignments. And then just some technical conclusions. As I said, the symbolism, I argue, does seem to be relevant within a 10-degree range. And I would say planetary alignments, conjunction squares, oppositions seem to be the most kind of critical. And of course, that was, noted by Richard Tarnas. And planetary crossings even over the AP seem relevant. Even interplanet retrogradation. So retrograde or direct stations, nodal crossings, eclipses. So just, putting all those pieces together. If a lot is happening, overlapping things happening, that might be indicating an AP moment. Okay, so if you are interested actually in the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, I did a very extensive article on this. I published this just before actually the Astro Bash conference last year that I'll be speaking again at, and actually presenting pretty much the same presentation, but I'm going to modify it a bit there. Actually, I might include a bit more personal stuff with that. But I integrated the Aries point into that, my delineation of that. So this builds a lot off the work of Tarnas that he had actually written about in Cosmos and Psyche in relation to Saturn-Neptune. So you can check that out from my website if you are interested. And that is cosmicmind.com, KOSMICMIND. And the best way to keep in touch with my work is through my free bi-monthly newsletter. And I do new and full moon readings there and little forecasts in between. And you will find out about any exclusive articles, research that I release through my website, through my newsletter. And you can also connect to me for personal readings and consultations through my website as well. I also have a YouTube channel, and there is a link to that on my website as well. So that is it.
Wow, thank you very much, Chad. That was a lot of information, really, really well researched and lots to think about. So we have a couple of questions in the chat. So this is curious how well you are at extrapolating past events with projected possibilities for the future. Do you use channeling, or are you an intuitive with other skill sets? What do you think of the potentialities will be with these future transits? Do you think the future space events will have to do with ETs and more people experimenting with astral travel and remote viewing for better or worse? Are we seeing an increase in psychedelics? And are you hopeful that these transits will bring positive changes given past events with similar aspects? I know that was a lot.
Yeah, very good questions. Yeah, I won't be able to address all of those in detail. Yeah, I would definitely recommend checking out my article because I do cover a lot of those speculations. I would say pretty much all astrologers probably have some intuitive element. I think it's part of the art. There is this moment of astrology, I guess you could say, when you're especially in counseling work, but even I would say when I'm doing research, I do get these like intuitive hits that I kind of follow, and they seem to kind of work out through research. It's very kind of an opposite approach to how science is done. It's like I actually start with some sort of intuitive hit, and then I'm like, huh, and then play with it, and that leads me to things. So I would say, yeah, definitely intuition is a part of that. But in terms of mundane research, I like this kind of empirical approach. It's just something I find interesting to work with. Yeah, I would say all the things you listed, there's a lot of possibilities there. I think, yeah, computer technology, AI, one of the things I did pull out from the Saturn-Neptune was this, this shift in consciousness in some way maybe that's through discovery or scientific breakthrough. I really felt like this conjunction was going to correlate with some major shift in our worldview and our understanding of reality in some really big way. That did seem to be a theme that I felt intuitively. And that's why I titled it From Disillusionment to Global Awakening, that it was this kind of, I wasn't really saying, this aggrandized, we're all getting enlightened and ascending to the fifth dimension kind of thing, but just that there is some sort of shift here that's very critical to changing our understanding of reality. But ultimately, I don't really know how that is. I really do. Again, I think astrology is more archetypally than concretely predictive. So a lot of possibilities. So yeah.
I think it's very interesting, your point about something being revealed that had been in the works or behind the scenes. So any thoughts about what she said, what she asked about, maybe increase of psychedelics or the ET connection?
Yeah, I mean, I've actually I'm really into ufology actually. And I would love to do some work with that, with astrology. That would be really interesting. And actually I've studied that a bit. I don't know. I mean, I definitely think something is going on there. I definitely think something's happening. There is a phenomenon. I think it all ties into a kind of, in my conception, into a broader um it's like all paranormal phenomenon to me are kind of all a part of that. So ghosts, telekinesis, telepathy, astral travel. I feel like all of these things touch on this larger dimension we're actually a part of and we're getting glimpses of. So in my view, I think the UFO phenomenon is just kind of a glimpse of that. So I don't know. Yeah, it would kind of fit. But it would be interesting to track the cycle of that, when UFOs started to emerge on the world scene and what kind of planetary cycles correlate with that.
Right, right. There were some big books about
Thank
it
you.
and things like that. Oh, yes, Chris. Chris was asking these questions. So, yes, did you have any follow-up questions, Chris?
I just was curious when you talked about like putting the two together. Not sure if you're familiar with Julia Velaz's work, Galactic Astrology, where she tracks the fixed stars, and QHHT, Dolores Cannon's work. Sorry, my dog's in the background.
Oh yeah, Dolores Cannon.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a bit familiar with her. I haven't really like studied it much, but I've seen some of her lectures and talks and read one of her books a while back. Yeah, really interesting.
We're certainly seeing an increase in psychedelics and interest in that and the whole ketamine movement. And
Yes.
yes, so which is very kind of maybe that Saturn, Neptune, still a little bit hidden, that maybe emerges more mainstream. So
Yeah, hopefully. I think, even MDMA therapy, I know that had a setback kind of recently, but yeah, very promising potential there. I mean, the research is there. It's just there's a lot of legal stuff and
oh yes,
ideological battles with materialism and
sure,
yeah, scientism.
yes,
Yeah, the microdosing of the mushrooms too is a big one that seems to be.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, and of course the Neptune at 29 Pisces really talks about that anyway.
Well,
And
it's
again,
interesting here in San Diego. I mean, I know tons of people that are just getting commercially made products that have mushrooms in them, right? There's companies that are making them and just selling them, and it's a whole kind of renaissance going on with that right now. You can easily access, gummies and chocolate bars, and these are all companies making this. It's happening.
yes, yeah. Lori has a question. So she asks if you'd looked at trines and sextiles to the Aries point.
I haven't much, and again, I kind of just narrowed my research just to simplify it because it can get super complicated. The French mundane astrologer André Babot, he was very influential in Tarnis and modern mundane astrology. He really paid a lot of attention to those other aspects, and stages of those cycles. And his book, I think I have it here. Yeah, this is actually, I think, the only English translation of his work. Planetary Cycles, really recommend that. And he actually covers a lot of different stages of these cycles in relation to certain themes. So if you're interested in that, he really does a lot with trines and so forth. But yeah, I just pay mostly attention to the harder quadrature axial alignments, as Tarnis coined it.
Yeah. John Townley did a lot on the Jupiter-Saturn cycles. And so I thought that was interesting because it came up a couple of times in your examples. So as big turning points. So that's all the questions we have in the chat. If you want to stop sharing your screen, then we'll invite all the participants to, if you have a question or if you have any comments, go ahead and unmute. And we do have Barbara Wengler saying, wonderful speaker, signed up for your newsletter. So yes, I encourage you guys to sign up for the newsletter.
I have a question. I'm kind of alluding to what Chris asked a few minutes ago. As far as the galactic center, obviously that would be important here. Do you work much with that or have any opinions on that?
I did a bit in my earlier studies. But yeah, I haven't really lately really paid much attention to it. And again, I think what the AP kind of took over that, but that is interesting that it's placed there too. It's on the AP axis.
Right. And that's why I was asking, because it's so notable in so many of the examples. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, very interesting.
I have a question. It's more like a personal question. I wasn't thinking that the AP point has any relevance in my chart, but then when I looked at it, I noticed that 2010, the conjunction, the Uranus-Jupiter conjunction was happening exactly when my divorce was finalized at that point. And so then I looked at my chart, and then my question would be, I either can go and say my moon is at 7 Capricorn, so that would push the boundary for what you would suggest, or I would look at an in conjunction to my chart ruler, which is Mars. So how would I go about discerning this kind of relevant, and also looking to the next one, the Saturn, Neptune, because I have Saturn in my 7th and Neptune in my 1st house. And so they're going to hit that point. So I was kind of thinking about how would I discern what is kind of activating what in my chart?
I mean, I would say, it is out of that 10-degree window. And again, this is kind of just a framework that I've been working with recently. And I'm open to that even being wider. It seems as well there's other figures that I've left out that were kind of out of that window. I mean, for example, like Adolf Hitler has a moon, I think at like 6 degrees Capricorn. So he's just like out of that window, but I would consider him, you know, one of those really dark examples, right? Negative examples of pushing boundaries. But yeah, I mean, so you mean in terms of how would you approach interpreting the future like transits to your chart?
Well, just like like when you think in terms of astrology. So if I again I made that observation, which there was seemed to be some relevance, and then now I'm trying to understand the astrology. Okay, but you know, like from what you're sharing, it seems all a little off. Or like I look at is it the in conjunction, or is it something completely different? And I was just wondering how would one it's like we could also think in terms of like whatever the astrology is showing, what's in my psyche maybe needing to activate to understand it. So that's kind of, I don't know, that was my question. I don't know if there's an answer to that or not.
Yeah. So you said, so you're interested in how these upcoming cycles will be affecting your moon? Because if I understood you correctly.
No, whether it seems like, even though I didn't think it was relevant, but when I looked at my own chart and my own history, it seems very relevant considering that.
Yeah, well, I would say
and it was very precise. And then I started thinking, well, yeah, but I don't have any major aspects to that point, other than I could look at my moon at 7 Capricorn, or I could look at my chart ruler, which would be an in conjunction, or my ascendant. Yeah, so then I would look at the in conjunction and consider that it's an in conjunction that activates that, or I don't know if that's a question. But,
yeah, I mean, as I started with, you talked about kind of how there's overlapping symbolism, right? So kind of starting with just, you know, how that divorce correlated with just the Uranus transit itself, and that orb itself would be pretty wide. I would actually use it, you know, so even if it's in that window, you know, the transit of Uranus over your moon, right? I think would definitely correlate with something like that, right? This
so then you would expand the.
Well, I don't.
Yeah. How much?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of natal, I like when I do readings, I do kind of narrow it even to like 4 degrees. Just I kind of work more with that in natal charts, and I was expanding it more because it seemed like collective events correlate more with the symbolism. But yeah, I mean, if you resonate with that, with the symbolism to your moon, I think.
Well, I said, like I was trying to explain it. It caught me by surprise, and then I looked into it. You see,
Yeah.
And then when you share these things, then I thought, okay, either it's a wider thing, or maybe it's something completely different. And how would I able to? I mean, I will observe, and then backwards I will understand. But so you wouldn't. Well, no, I mean, so you. Okay, I will see what.
Yeah, it might just be the stimulation to your moon is a critical placement for you somehow. So whenever
so then it would be a bigger orbit, like a wider range, like considering that.
I mean, I don't know. I can't see your chart, but I mean, it sounds.
No, I understand, but this would be one way of looking at it, basically.
I think a lot of times when you're dealing with personal stuff, like when you do research, we're looking at these major events. And so when you dive more into the personal, a lot of times the orbs can get a little wider because you're so connected to your own personal experience that it's going to trigger things versus when you're doing research and looking at the community as a whole, we have to kind of focus on the events more. So I would suspect that very likely you're going to find that this is going to have a wider orb in your personal life, especially that moon.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that, so I can zone into that area more.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Does anyone else have, and Chris says wonderful information. Thank you. And it was so much research. Thank you so much for that. Anybody else have any questions? Chris, you are muted, so there you go.
Hi, I just have a quick question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
When so I'm not a proficient astrologer by any means, so I'm just kind of asking this question out loud. When you look at Neptune and Saturn, sometimes I think of consequences when you go to like lower vibrational things with Neptune, and I definitely see the rabbit hole with the psychedelics. I have a friend who actually owns a MAPS program where they do psychedelics, and she, you know, there's somebody in town who was, you know, not scrupulous, and somebody who worked for my friend committed suicide going to this other person, you know, getting ketamine. So just the question is, do you see like the Saturn is sometimes that stern parent to say, there's different vibrations with, you know, being out there, so to speak, especially with.
Yeah, you're cutting out a little bit, but yeah, I think from what you're saying, yeah, in my article, I deal a lot with kind of seeing it from both sides, seeing how Neptune is influencing Saturn and Saturn is influencing Neptune. So there is kind of this back and forth that does seem to emerge collectively, you know, in terms of like disillusionment, or, you know, like, you know, Saturn coming in and bringing the hard reality to that Neptune idealism. So yeah, that's a really good, really creative way of looking at it, because it's like, that's definitely a potentiality of that Saturnian authority, you know, kind of cracking in and narrowing that expansive Neptunian vision. But then also you have that Neptunian vision coming in and informing the Saturnian. And so there's this kind of back and forth, I would say. And so a lot of things going on. And as we saw in a lot of the examples, right, there's a lot of different types of events going on simultaneously at these historical periods, like, you know, LSD coming into the world, and then the height of Nazi Germany, and bombs being, you know, atomic bombs being developed. And so I do think it's a kind of back and forth. So that answers the question.
Great, wonderful. So anyone else? So Chad, thank you so much for all your hard work on this. And again, it's Cosmic Mind with a K, right?
Yep.
And so we can find Chad, who is local here, which is great. Next month, I didn't prepare. Who knows who we're having next month?
Adam Ellenboss?
Adam Ellenboss was going to talk about Saturn. And so we hope you'll join us. And of course, if you want to get our notifications, then sending Kelly your information, and then she will send you out those notifications. And I will see you guys all next month.
Thank you, Chad. It was wonderful.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Chad. It was extraordinary.
Thank you.
Thank you, buddy. Fabulous. Chad's a fabulous astrologer too, by the way.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye.
See you next month.